is our incredible leadership of the Executive Director of CEPH, Laura Razor-King, and its Deputy Director, Molly Mulvanity. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
All right, terrific, Ian. Now we're going to turn over the mic to our CEPH colleagues.
So this is Molly, and Laura and I are both here, eager to take your questions. I actually really enjoy, we both really enjoy doing events like this because it's so much more productive for us to get questions or for us to get comments that are I want to say well-informed, that are not, so if there's something that you're just thinking, I don't even understand what they're saying, it's less a benefit for us to get a comment that sort of says, I don't even understand what you're saying. So we really appreciate these opportunities because it enables you to make comments that the council can use much more readily.
Okay, Molly, thanks so much. David, we're going to turn the mic back to you for taking over leading the rest of the call with our moderation regarding the questions.
All right, thanks, Liz. And I just, want to make sure everybody really appreciates getting to see my picture a second time. You might even get to see it a third time. It's really awesome. Thanks, Liz. So this next slide is meant to give me the opportunity to remind you that we've already made one round of responses to the curriculum criteria. The first release of proposed criteria really focused on the curriculum. We went through a similar process that was, I think, very rigorous and comprehensive and inclusive of many viewpoints. With Liz's great work and the input from many, many of our members and representatives, we were able to send comments in to CEPH. My impression of what is incorporated in this round of criteria with respect to curriculum reflects CEPH having taken our comments very seriously and made some significant changes to the proposed criteria. As a result of that, I think it might be more useful for us to focus today and perhaps even in this entire round of responses on issues that are outside of the curriculum criteria. And that's not to say we can't comment on the current draft of the curricular criteria, but this is the first time we've seen the other aspects of the newly proposed criteria. So it is certainly very important that we take a look at those other aspects of accreditation criteria. So the next slide shows you in an outline format what those are in the new proposed criteria, and you've probably already seen them, but there are now A through H, organization and decision making, mission and evaluation, resources, curriculum, which is the aspect that we've reviewed previously, faculty, community engagement, diversity, and student services. So as we go through this call, we may start with coming back to this slide and walking through it and seeing if there are particular questions or comments that people have in any of these sections regarding the newly proposed criteria. Liz, could you go to the next slide, please? So there's a lot of groups that have been activated to take a look at the criterion. These are the groups that ASPPH has put together and is staffing to enable us and our members to provide feedback to CEPH and to ASPPH first and then to CEPH regarding these criteria. So these are a lot of groups. I'm not going to read them out, but we'll leave it up here just for a moment so that you can see the extent to which we're getting input. That also means it's going to be quite challenging to pull this all together, but I'm confident that we'll be able to do that based on the excellent outcome of the first round of review of the curriculum criteria. Liz, could we take a look at the next slide? So, you obviously can comment directly to CEPH. What we're trying to do is pull together comments and input from our members, but in no way is that meant to infringe upon your ability to respond directly to CEPH. There may be some things where you have a very strong opinion where the consensus of the group is a bit different, and so you should certainly let your voice be heard, or you may want to reinforce something that ASPPH is commenting on. So please feel free to comment directly to CEPH, and this information shows you how you can do that. And finally, just to remind you on the next slide, this is a way to enter information, ask questions, make comments in the webinar today so that we can get your input. Now if we could go back to slide 9, I just might open this up to tee off if there are comments or questions. We'll start perhaps first with section A. I think it was slide 9, the criteria in round 2. Yes. Are there any comments or questions from the group regarding, we could start first with section A, I suppose, but if you have a burning question or comment in any section, when you make your question or comment, it would be helpful if you refer to the section and the criteria that you're thinking about.
David, as of now, there are no questions in the question box related to slide A. So we could give folks a minute or two if you'd like, or we could move on.
Well, if there are none about A, again, if you have questions or comments about section B, it'd be useful to hear from you about them, or C, or you can just go down the list. Again, I think, today I'd really like to make sure we have the opportunity to focus on issues other than curriculum initially, since we've had extensive discussion of curriculum. We have had a question come up about faculty, so if we're at that point, we can go to the slide in the slide deck that has a question about faculty numbers. So this question has really come up in some of the previous discussions about the new proposed criteria for instructional faculty in schools where there is, and for programs where there is a requirement for schools for at least 21 faculty, for programs for at least 3, and that for each concentration, which as I read it, I take it to mean either at the master's or the doctoral level, there's a requirement for 3 instructional faculty per concentration with a dedicated leader who can only lead 1 concentration and who can only participate as an instructional faculty member in 1 other concentration. What I think is less clear to me is whether the other participating faculty, how many concentrations they can participate in if they are not leading any concentrations. But this is the aspect of faculty kind of accounting for faculty resources to make sure that there are sufficient resources for high quality degree delivery and student access. So is there, I guess we can start with a little bit of a discussion from our CEPH representatives. If you would like to share with us the thought process behind the number 3, the 1 concentration per faculty member as a leader, and how many concentrations a faculty member can participate in if they are not leading any concentrations.
Yeah, so this is Molly. David has brought us straight into the deep area of the weeds, analyzing in which we analyze them and slice and dice them can sound like it gets complicated fast. But the first thing I want to say is that there has been absolutely no change in the first set of numbers. The numbers 21 for a school and 3 for a program are exactly where they are and have been since the 2005 criteria revision. So that absolute number is not a change. Also, there really isn't a change, although there's actually a slight change toward flexibility for programs. programs since 2005 have had to have 3 faculty members per concentration, no matter how many concentrations they have, whatever the concentrations were in. Because in our model in 2005 and 2011, schools were founded and based and defined around the 5 core areas, we analyzed faculty resources in schools based on the 5 core areas rather than based on concentrations. I think what our discussions in the time since then, and certainly when it came down to the actual putting things down on paper phase, there wasn't necessarily a good rationale for not having quantitative requirements for concentrations in schools. If we thought they were important in programs, it's a little bit unclear about why we would think they were not or less important in schools. Plus, with this revision, the structure imposed by the 5 core areas doesn't exist anymore. So we had to start at a new place in defining faculty. So it made sense to go back to the model that we knew has been relatively successful, which is 3. And I may call on one of our counselors to give a little bit of the sort of more qualitative aspect, sort of philosophical discussions of the aspect of why we still felt that 3 was a good number. We didn't just blindly go to it because it's what we've had. But before that, I want to clarify a couple other technical issues. The new faculty model, the way faculty are reported in templates C21 and C21 and C22, the way faculty are reported is intended to reflect what you have been telling us since 2005, that faculty teach across multiple concentrations, and a model that forces us to categorize them into one concentration only just isn't a workable model. So that's where we started. And then we realized we had to put some parameters around this, because if you start allowing any combination, you know, as the statisticians among us can start to calculate, you can actually create a lot of concentrations with a small number of people if you are allowed to endlessly rotate them and create endless permutations. So we ran a bunch of scenarios to try and figure out what parameters we could put that would make some sense and also allow us to have a reasonable handle on faculty resource and not just be reshuffling the same 3 people to create 3 concentrations at 3 degree levels, which we discovered is possible if you don't put some parameters on it. So the idea is that the concentration leader you know, is exactly as it sounds, and the concentration leader can participate in as many additional concentrations as he or she is qualified to and wants to. So that's the first important point, that the concentration leader can be in endless other concentrations if their contribution is appropriate. However, that concentration leader can only count towards a minimum of 3 in one additional concentration, if that makes sense. So this is some of our reducing those endless permutations kind of math logic. And so the idea is to show everyone's participation in all the ways that are appropriate to the school and to the individual's qualifications, but also to put some parameters so that you have a certain critical mass in each concentration. So every person, concentration leader or no, should be represented in all of the concentrations and degree levels with which he or she is affiliated. But when we're doing that minimum count, do you get to 3? Do you get to the minimum threshold? That's when we impose the rules about concentration leader is only the leader in 1, and concentration leader can only count toward the minimum of 3 in one additional concentration. So anybody can participate in as many as possible. We're only putting parameters about how you count to get to that basic 3. And now, I don't know, Ian, would you like to say something about our discussion about how we sort of reinforced that 3 was an okay number and some of the philosophy?
Thanks, Molly. I'll just make a few brief comments, but would welcome John or Rahman or Ruth jumping in as well. I think this is a good example where the council really was focused on, you know, how do we assure quality? How do we assure excellence? And it was just that, you know, one of the aspects of the conversation is what is that right critical mass where you actually have faculty that can dialogue about the curriculum, its implications for field practice, as well as the right number of faculty engaged in research or practice-based research in these areas, were some of the aspects of the conversation that played itself out. But if other counselors want to add to that, or I'd welcome their thoughts.
Yes, this is John Finnegan. I agree with that very much. I think the issue is again, it's looking at threshold issues about what is the threshold of capacity in this particular area, and certainly there's a lot of debate on where one draws that, but I think this was a way to draw that line and in a reasonable fashion, and I think based on a lot of academic experience, this seemed to be probably the best threshold that we could come up with that has a good rationale. So this is it is always a sticky question, but I do think that the capacity issue, as Ian said, is exactly the reason there needs to be some specification in this area.
So the other thing that I might just sort of say, not to beat this point too deeply, but the council has been very consistent in communicating our three major purposes in this criteria revision: reporting, flexibility, and quality. And so this criteria, the council was very cognizant of all three of those things. So quality is really paramount, because we were trying to say what thresholds can we set, as Ian and John have just mentioned, that are going to at least be some kind of proxy for quality or create the environment for quality to arrive. And on the flexibility and innovation, the flexibility and innovation and the reducing reporting burden, this was a response to folks who said, gosh, your way of making us put faculty in boxes is not working for us. It's challenging us, it's making our reporting not make sense to us. And also recognizing that the future definitely involves a lot of interprofessional and interdisciplinary work. And so we want to sort of encourage that in our reporting in the ways that we can. We think that should support those kind of future-looking ideas.
So I also want to just clarify one of the aspects of the question that I thought I heard on a previous call, and it had to do with the additional faculty who are not concentration leaders. So there's not a limit in the number of concentrations for which they can count toward the 3 minimum if they're not a concentration
leader. That's correct.
Okay,
that's correct.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Right, and so that's, again, that's as long as it makes sense, right? Because it is unlikely that a single individual could be, appropriate instructionally for a vast array of very different types of concentrations and degree levels. So, of course, it's subject to the kinds of peer review, and we'll be looking at faculty qualifications in a later criterion to make sure it makes sense. But, David, you're absolutely right. There is no limit on the number in which they can count toward that 3.
Thank you. So this question actually really is more about Section C in the criteria around resources than Section E, faculty, but it kind of overlaps. Any comments or questions? Have any come in while we've been having this discussion, Liz, about this particular issue?
No new ones, and there's just a very general question in there that we could come back to later.
Okay. So if we look back at the criteria, the next criterion on the list beyond faculty is community engagement, and then diversity, and finally student services. Are there questions or comments from people on the webinar about any of the criteria in any of these sections? Have any come in the chat box, Liz?
Yes, one just came in, and it's asking for the rationale for removing unemployed job seeking as a category in job placement reports. So that's dealing with, I'm supposing, one of the data templates.
Yeah, we didn't change the data template for employment. So if there's an error in the template, maybe just a copy and paste error, I can go back and look at that later. But the template is exactly as it is in the current criteria.
Which makes me think that that is on the table in one of the discussions, I'm believing the data committee, as a potential revision posed to the group. And so the questioner might have thought that was the CEPH proposed category, but I'm kind of trying to recall that conversation of among the 20 or so calls I've been on. And I believe that group, the data committee, is going to be making some recommendations regarding that data template for student reporting.
Great.
Dealing with what's going on with the students after graduation.
Yeah, I know the data committee's done some great work on that, so we're very excited to hear the comments.
And that's all we have that's specific, David, in the question box. Again, just, oh, here's one. Hot off the press, can we discuss the criteria defining the school as one MPH and one PhD, but means a doctoral degree? And what's the rationale for that change? Right, so it was just amended doctoral.
Yeah, so this is David. This is a question that we have spent a fair amount of time on, and we are going to come back to. We will absolutely discuss that. There's one other question I want to make sure we get to first, because we suspect that that question may end up taking a fair amount of time. So there was a question about the DRPH that has come up and is being discussed by the DRPH working group. That is one of the many working groups that ASPPH has activated for reviewing the criterion. And the question is really shown on this slide. So with respect to doctoral education in public health, the DRPH degree, is this a public health practice leadership-oriented degree, or is it one that prepares graduates for roles in academic research? Now, you know, within our Framing the Future document process, the definition of the DRPH that comes out of that process is really focused on the DRPH being the senior leadership degree in public health practice. And of course that includes some exposure to practice-based research and preparation of public health practice leadership for collaboration and participation in research with academic partners. But the degree as it's described in the Framing the Future document looks different qualitatively from a PhD program. We're aware, and perhaps Ian or John can comment on this in more depth, that some members are using the DRPH degree in a very flexible manner that enables schools to have some students get a DRPH that's very research intensive, where their experience looks much like the experience of a PhD student. If we have a degree defined with that amount of flexibility, the challenge that we're hearing from some of our colleagues at CEPH, and they may want to comment on this, or again, perhaps John and Ian as CEPH counselors can comment on this, makes it difficult to come up with a set of parsimonious, coherent accreditation criteria for the curriculum of such a degree. So this has been an issue of a lot of discussion, and I'd be interested in hearing from Ian and John and perhaps some of our CEPH colleagues on this particular issue before we get to the question that came in about the structure of schools.
Yeah. John, maybe you've spoken very eloquently about this issue and have, I think, some institutional experience on this. Do you want to maybe start things off, and Laura and Molly might want to jump in as well?
Ian, it's Liz. John was in a car. He had to sign off, so it's back to you for starters.
All right. There we go. So this is, as we've talked about in the accreditation, ASPPH accreditation subgroup, another one of those philosophical issues that also deals with the practical. It has been our observation when you look at the landscape of DRPH programs that the degree has emerged to be what it is at different institutions, often due to institutional barriers that the school can offer the PhD, most recognized research doctoral degree. There also are variants of the degree that are sort of hybrid between that of a research doctorate and that of a more practice or leadership doctorate. And then there is also another segment of programs out there, many of them more recently developed in the last 5 to 10 years, that more resemble a lot of the framing that is discussed in the Framing the Future task force. And so I think one of the questions out there is, what role does this criteria play in affirming where the field sees the future of the degree? Or is this an example where we want to offer flexibility, but what does that actual impact have for helping to better give an identity to the DRPH degree? So those are some of the issues out there. One thing just as a thought piece on this, if we were to leave the criteria as it's written, would this help schools and programs be able to go to their provosts or to their system and say that we'd like to offer the DRPH degree in the manner as described, and our accreditation expects us to do such? So a lot of different issues circle around on this, and lots to be discussed. Laura or Molly, do you want to add anything, or Aman or Ruth?
Ian, I think you framed the issue really appropriately. I will say that I'm also a part of the group that is looking at this for the DRPH, more so that I can kind of hear, really as an observer, so that I can hear the rationale and hear where the group is going with it. And so I think it is a philosophical issue, and I do think that for the purposes to sort of answer the question on the table for everybody, I think the council's discussions really intended to frame the degree as a professional doctoral degree in public health. Similar to what almost every other health profession has at this point in time, so that public health has a real professional doctoral degree. I think that was the intent of the council, and certainly these criteria are out for comment, so I anticipate that there'll be a lot of discussion on this, but I think you framed it appropriately. And I also think, and I will work with Liz to kind of quantify a little bit more, but really from our more knowing the schools as we do and having worked with them all, we think that there are probably only about 3 or 4 schools that actually are using the DRPH as a research degree because they can't offer the PhD. There are some perhaps who have it really have framed it as a research degree because they want to, but they also have PhD degrees as well. So I think, so as a practical matter, I think it really impacts few schools, and that doesn't mean that we don't care about that impact, but just to quantify that, I think that's important as well.
So thank you both for that input. The other aspect of what could happen if these criteria continue forward as they're currently envisioned and the DRPH becomes very firmly identified as the professional doctorate, is that may also provide leverage to schools to go back to their provosts to say, well, in addition to the DRPH, which is a professional doctorate, we would like to be able to offer a research doctorate, because it's very important that we generate research scientists at the doctoral level in public health disciplines. So that's another aspect of how this approach to the DRPH could be helpful to our members. Liz, have any, before we move away from this, Ruth or Iman or anyone else on the call want to contribute to this or have any comments come up in the comment box on this topic?
No, I agree with the discussion. It was very well described.
I think this is a really good discussion, and there's really nothing more to add from me either. Thank you, though.
Okay, thank you, Aman and Ruth. And I'd like to recognize, if we haven't already, that our current CPH board chair, Donna Peterson's on travel, otherwise would be joining us. David, another question has come into the box, and this relates to F1, community involvement in school program evaluation and assessment. And if you want to go to the line, it's regarding the required documentation. So we're looking at 1903. And this required documentation, it's the first item, and it states, describe any formal structures for constituent input, and it lays out some examples. Our community advisory board, alumni association, etc. And here's the question. To clarify, does CEPH expect that such formal structures must exist for schools programs, or are other approaches to attaining constituent feedback, such as annual focus groups or stakeholder feedback sessions and surveys, are they considered sufficient to fulfill this requirement?
And the answer is, based on our discussion so far, yes. The structure is flexible as long as the intent of this criterion and the requirements of this criterion are getting accomplished. Because those kinds of boards are very prevalent, that was the first thing we figured would come to most people's heads, and that's the first documentation request. But if the answer to that documentation request is that we don't have a community advisory board, we use other methods as described below in number 2, that would be an appropriate situation.
Great. There's a little feedback, unless there's any more comments by the panelists on the call. Okay. Thorough answer there. We are going to, a few comments back on the Drph discussion. I'd just like to read them out. That one of the participants says, I agree that the Drph should be a professional degree, and I would want us to affirm the expectation to have DRPHs actually teaching and in leadership within the schools. Reactions? Either in the chat box or from panelists.
This is David, and I think, you know, I hear exactly where that's coming from. Most of our faculty at most schools and programs have PhDs rather than DRPHs. You know, if we are affirming that the DRPH is the professional doctorate within public health, then it would certainly make sense to have that degree and that expertise represented among our faculty. One of the things that I've seen or heard is that it's difficult sometimes for PhD-trained faculty to be outstanding mentors for students who are interested in pursuing the DRPH degree just by virtue of the different background, different interests, different passions that people have. And so I think it's the comment is quite good that it would be desirable to have a balance within the faculty. You know, whether that should be described in the accreditation criteria in terms of faculty resources, I suppose is another matter. But if we think about the part of the criterion that talks about the appropriateness of the faculty for the concentrations that they're participating in, you know, it would certainly be reasonable to have some DRPH trained educated faculty participating in DRPH education in particular, but in public health education more broadly. That's my take on it, but I don't know whether it needs to be specified as a requirement or whether it should be evaluated in the process of accreditation. Ian, do you have a comment on that?
Sure. I think, you know, I really appreciate, David, how you frame that, in the sense this would be our common theme as I think we move forward through rounds 2, 3, and as needed 4, is when is it the role of accreditation, and when is it the way the field defines things? I think the key thing that I heard coming out of that question is really an affirmation that if we want to take what is, I think, a real growing chorus of comments about where the DRPH should be, where accreditation criteria can really affirm, and well, Dean Finnegan's no longer on the line, can kind of set the floor for the degree rather than what exists right now where you have such a variety of types of students graduating with this degree. And so this could be the generational change for the field that at least those who are advocating for a DRPH as described in the Framing the Future Task Force really seek. And so we're defining quality and excellence in a very specific way here. So I like the nature of the question. We could debate what goes in and what's out, but it does seem like an affirmation that the criteria should once and for all really define the DRPH in some manner, at least similar to what the criteria currently is written as.
This is Laura. I also wanted to compliment Dean Goff on your understanding of how the criteria fit together, because as you were talking, I was thinking, oh, that's exactly the answer I would have given. And I think that the commenter, I'm not sure who made the comment, but that's really, you know, that's an astute comment, and it's something that we do talk about. And we do have in E1, we talk about faculty education and experience being appropriate for the degree level and the nature of the degree. And so that's kind of where you capture that more qualitative sense of the faculty and the mentoring aspect of, you know, practice faculty, mentoring people preparing for practice, that kind of thing. But it's definitely more complicated than just, you know, someone trained with a DRPH should be mentoring, you know, someone training for a DRPH, because really sort of where we are now is that there are a lot of people with a DRPH that really were trained in research just like a PhD. So we wouldn't, and there are also plenty of people with a PhD who are actually very active practice-based folks. And so we would really take that as, from an accreditation perspective, as a much more qualitative analysis of how it was working at that particular school. So it's probably nothing we would count at this point. I'm not sure the field is ready for that, but it's definitely something that we take into consideration.
And oh, go ahead. And this,
I was just going to say, our framework for in E1 that Laura was just talking about, so we say faculty should be appropriate for the degree level and the nature of the degree, but then how do we define appropriate? The structure we use is education and experience, and we talk a little bit about what those two things mean. Experience especially is a larger umbrella, although even education has some nuance to it. So we sort of look at the totality using that structure, education plus experience, to judge whether an individual is a good fit for the degree level and the type of degree.
Thank you, Molly. And this is Liz. I would like to call out lines 912 through 914, which is in D2, the DRPH proposed competencies. And there's a new pedagogy section there that speaks to this, delivering that the DRPH candidate would need to be able to exhibit delivering training or educational experiences, and using best practice modalities and pedagogical practices. So just there's another question here that's come in related to the DRPH. Then we have a couple more I'd like to try to get through before our time's up. And this question is, are you moving towards requiring a DRPH in schools for those of us who only have PhD degrees?
That is nothing, this is Laura, that is nothing that we discussed. So I would say no. I mean, we haven't even discussed that. It's not, that's not on our radar screen at all.
Okay, that was easy
and
answer.
I would say that relates to the question that we have put off for now, which is the degree offerings in schools of public health in section A5, which we will come back to in a few minutes.
Okay. All right, David, so I'll move on to this one. This question relates to D12, lines 1431 through 1442. I'd like to confirm that this requirement could be met by either a 3-credit course that addresses the competencies noted, or a non-credit online modular course that requires completion and student assessment, but is not credit-bearing. Is that understanding correct?
Yes, that understanding is correct.
Okay. Great, and we are going to be providing a summary of this call that if you need to get back to a question and how it was answered, that this will be included. Next one. It seems to me that if engaged scholarship is a core competency or underlying principle of applied public health research, then the line between PhD, academic, and DRPH professional is blurry. And Laura and Molly, if you could direct us to what section, engaged scholarship.
I assume that's referring to criterion D2.
Okay, let's go to D2 and see. And questioner, if you're still there, if it's not D2, would you clarify? We're going to assume that that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think we use the word engaged scholarship anywhere.
Is it in the research? The commenter could refer us to the line.
No. Yeah, we actually use the word engaged, never in that context, actually, in the document. So I'm not exactly sure what the reference is to. I could only imagine that that was sort of a paraphrase of criterion D2, which is the DRPH primary competencies.
Or is it in the research? Is it
Yeah,
in?
we don't use
no,
that
we don't
word
use it.
No.
Okay, here's some clarification from the questioner. Really just speaking to the distinction between the PhD and the DRPH in the intent, our school has adopted engaged scholarship as an underlying principle.
So
Scholarship is a very broad term. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I was going to question the person with the question about if you're talking about engaged scholarship, if you're thinking about community-based participatory research or community-engaged research, or you know, scholarship is more than just research, of course. So what is the, you know, I think the distinction that some see between the PhD and the DRPH, I would say is to some extent similar to the distinction between the MD and the PhD, right? So it's the leadership degree in public health practice at the doctoral level, which benefits from some understanding and ability to collaborate and participate in research that's appropriate to the setting of professional activity, similar to an MD. But is not the same as a PhD. So I don't know if that's helpful as the analogy, but I'd be interested in more of a discussion of the blurriness that you see from engaged scholarship. We expect both MDs and PhDs to have engaged scholarship. We expect, especially if they're on a faculty, we expect nursing faculty similarly to have engaged scholarship, whether they have a PhD or a DNP. So I'm not sure. It would be helpful to understand the blurriness better.
And the other thing that I just want to mention, Ian has done a really good job, and some of the other commenters have done a good job of indicating, you know, it's really helpful to us. At the end of the day, you know, we have to write accreditation criteria, and we are going to say something about what the DRPH is, and we do say something about what the PhD is. So it's really helpful for us. You know, these are complicated discussions that will play out over time and will take many, probably different forms over time. But you know, we do want to be able to write a set of accreditation criteria that's useful to the field, that's useful to stakeholders, that's useful to prospective students, that's useful to members of the public in understanding what it means to have an accredited degree. And so I think that's the framework, the practical framework that I think it's Laura and I, it's our job to come back to at the end of the day, is what can we do that's going to be helpful in framing this discussion in the accreditation criteria.
Excellent, thank you. It's proposed here by another questioner that the issue of engaged scholarship is a principle that originated in the Demonstrating Excellence in Practice-Based Research document, which is really a very strong document a lot of people have tried to adopt in some way, shape, or form in our member institutions. So David, there are no more questions other than the generic question I mentioned. Would you like to get back to, in our last 9 minutes or so, the more philosophical question about the A5?
Yes, I think this is a good time to shift to A5 to make sure that we have some some discussion of this before time expires. So this is the question about the number of degrees that a school must offer compared to a program. So if you look at section A5 and the criteria, a program must offer at least 1 degree in a public health field, and it can be either a master's or a doctoral, as I understand it. For a school must offer at least 1 professional public health master's degree, so for example the MPH, and at least 1 doctoral degree, which can be either the Drph or the PhD, and there is no longer the requirement that there be 5 MPHs covering the core areas and at least 3 doctoral degrees. The criterion as currently proposed is 1 and 1 is the minimum number required. And this has led to some, I would say, some substantive philosophical discussion on some previous calls that I'll try to summarize here briefly, and I hope that others on the call can help me. So if we take a student perspective on the quality of their academic experience, this criterion, 1 + 1 for a school and at least 1 for a program, means that there may be relatively little difference in some ways between a small school and a large program, or between a small school and a program in particular. But for an individual student, if we're thinking about their quality of their academic experience, it shouldn't necessarily matter whether they go to a school or whether they go to a program. They should be able to get an outstanding academic experience and come out with excellent public health competencies appropriate to the degree that they have pursued. And so if we think that this criterion kind of minimizes some of the differences between schools and programs, from an individual student perspective, perhaps that's okay. But then people have asked the question, well, should a school be expected to be making a more broad impact through the totality of their graduating class and through the totality of their research programming and through the totality of their community impact through partnership and workforce development? Should a school be expected to be making a broader impact through its collective output? And if so, how do you define that? How do you know it when you see it? And in the past, it was 5 master's degrees, 1 in each of the core areas, and at least 3 doctoral degrees. And 1 + 1 may not be right, but what is the right way to identify a school? Is it sufficient to say it's the autonomous organizational administration where the school reports to the highest level in the university and the minimum number of faculty being exceeded with appropriate faculty for the concentrations that are delivered? Is that sufficient, or is there some other filter that we want to describe? And if so, what is it? What is it? How do we know a school when we see it? Ian, you've been very thoughtful on this issue. Would you like to comment?
Sure. Well, first, again, David, thank you for a wonderful summary. This is a real tough issue, and I think it goes back to, again, what is the role of criteria? What is the role of the field, an organization like ASPPH, and for that matter, the marketplace? And so I think this is an example here where, I hope that everyone on the call and beyond will think about, what is the issue around quality that plays itself out if one was to actually do one-on-one? Could one deliver quality and reach an impact with that? The other thing also, which I'll just add, and Molly noted very early on, is the issue about flexibility. And so, you know, part of, I think, a lot of the conversation was whatever number we came up with seemed quite arbitrary, other than what has become sort of a holy number in our field thanks to criteria of the number 5. And so are we indeed producing quality if we mandate 3 fields of study in the MPH? You know, are we not offering quality if all we require is 1 PhD? You know, I think one of the issues that one might think about is, you know, should the criteria focus in on the scale of the organization, the nature of the organization, rather than on the degree offerings as a definition of what is a school or program?
I just wanted to make 2 observations that have come up from different folks during different phases of the discussion of this particular aspect. The first one is sort of a practical consideration. We've said that the floor for a school is 21 full-time faculty. I think the likelihood that you could hire 21 people just doing the exact same thing is slim. I'm not saying it's non-existent, because some of our larger schools probably have research groups that are that large. But in general, the number is going to get us a certain degree of diversity on its own. I think that's one sort of practical consideration. And the second one is one that comes, I would say, from probably our staff perspective, working with a lot of developing prospective, you know, programs and schools over the years, that sometimes there's a pressure to sort of, what's the word, to proliferate and create concentrations where they aren't necessarily wanted or needed. And to maybe make some arbitrary distinctions to get yourself to a certain number of concentrations. And we kind of don't want to force institutions into playing a kind of a hokey game where they're making really fine line distinctions that don't really exist just for the purpose of getting to a certain number of concentrations. And that's something I've sort of seen you know, over the years and experiences developing institutions. The other piece that I would say is when we think about the 3 differences that exist in this set of criteria, between schools and programs, there's the autonomy issue, the number of faculty issue, and the must offer both master's and doctoral issue. So those are the kind of 3 issues. There is no program that I've ever worked with or known except those transitioning to schools that have autonomy that could meet that. I have never met a program or seen a program that meets that characteristic. The other 2, certainly question mark. But, you know, I think that, and we heard in earlier phases of this discussion on criteria that autonomy was a, if not the, fundamental principle that was important to folks in terms of, you know, preserving quality in our field.
Ruth, you represent a program. Would you like to make any comments here?
Sorry for my delay. I was unmuting. Well, you know, we have been saying over and over again for each question the 2 important words that the Council has been trying to wrestle with, which is quality and flexibility. So I think for this question as well, we have been trying to make sure we articulate for the degrees for which we accredit how to measure what are ways of ensuring quality education. So that's one thing. And then the flexibility that comes with programs and schools as a context that recognizes that the quality of the education is measured separately from, you know, what we would envision as a program or school's different in the qualifications. So, I mean, we've been walking the line. The quality and flexibility for the education programs should set a high standard, no matter where they are situated in a school or program. And then the second issue is programs and schools obviously have differences of scale. And for those differences of scale, how do we measure quality and create some flexible standards for each of those? recognizing the roles, that each plays in the larger institution and university. So, we are all sort of trying to find this balance, and I think what you see here is an articulation that captures both our commitment to quality and flexibility in the education programs, and also acknowledging that they can be then situated, these degrees, in different types of institutional structures and arrangements, for which we also are wanting to understand the quality measures that are helpful for those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Ruth, I think that's very helpful, and I think what our members on the webinar may be appreciating is the extent of discussion that is going on around this issue, and that we will continue to seek your input from all members on this issue. This is the kind of discussion that, had we led this webinar with addressing this issue, we might have discussed this single issue for the entire hour, and we may very well, try to set up a time to do precisely that, to see where people come down in terms of the issue of how do you know a school when you see one, and is it sufficient to have the autonomy and the minimum number of faculty without perhaps the same level of attention to the number and scope of the different degree programs that are housed within the school, so that this minimum of 1 and 1 is enough, even though we would expect the vast majority of schools to have many more concentrations than a single master's and a single doctoral degree. We've reached the end of our hour. We're actually a couple minutes over, I think, and I want to thank everyone for their participation. And I want to give people an opportunity for any last words that they would like to provide beyond thanking everyone for being on the call and for their participation. We'll look forward to your continued input. There are ways in which you can give that input, which I think include the ASPPH listening online discussion communities. This slide shows our next steps. And so you'll see we have a final deadline of a response to CEPH by January 8, and there's a number of steps between now and then. Let's see, I think the final thing to mention before turning it back over to Liz is that we're going to be taking all the comments very seriously from today and the other working groups and looking at the criteria. We'll be disseminating a draft response to the institutional representatives for their comment, and we'll be monitoring the discussions that happen online. And I think there's a slide that reminds people of how to get to the online community. And then I want to thank Liz and her colleagues at ASPPH for the wonderful work they do to support us. Gary or Liz, any last words?
No, just thank you, David, and thank you to everyone for this outstanding work, and making excellent progress on this, and these are very, very critical discussions, I think, that are going to be very useful to helping frame where things go forward. So thank you again so much.
Thanks, Gary. Liz?
Yes, this is Liz. Very much agree with Gary, and David, thank you so much for your leadership. Appreciate the attendance of all those. There are a few questions that were not answered, and count on us to make sure those answers are made available. In addition, there'll be an archived version and some very brief minutes from a summary of this discussion posted in the online community and circulated for all those who were on the call and who missed the call. So with that, we're going to close out this webinar, and hope you all have a terrific day.